This is Theology Bits with Pastor Ben, a ministry of Central Lutheran Church, Eugene, Oregon. This week, we go into our continuing series, Continuity and Change in the Old Testament, the 7th installment on the book of Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy is very interesting because it is, in fact, a retelling of much of the same story as was in the book of both Numbers and Exodus, especially Exodus, and a special focus for our theology bits on Sinai, where they received the Ten Commandments, though in Deuteronomy it's not called Sinai, it's called Horeb, another name for the same place. Now, to understand this retelling and why it's important, we are in fact jumping forward in time. It's very difficult to know when Exodus was written, but the character of Moses, if you can put a date to the character of Moses, something like the 15th to 13th century BCE. Well, so a long time in the past, 1400 something to 1200 something BC. And again, very hard to know exactly when Exodus was written. It was probably written in stages. There's different theories going on. But Deuteronomy is different because in the book of 2 Kings, there's an event that happens that we can be pretty confident about in 622 BCE, where in the temple, when King Josiah is on the throne of Judah, they discover a book of the law in the temple, and they describe it in some length, and this happens in 622. And we can be pretty sure of that for other reasons. And when they do their description, it becomes pretty clear that this book of the law is Deuteronomy. It's also clear that before this time, in the history that spans from the beginning of Joshua through 2 Kings, which we'll talk about in our next Theology Bits video, that they have not been reflecting the kind of things in the book of Deuteronomy before this time. So many have wondered, was it in fact during this period of 622, or at least near it, or recently to it, that this retelling was actually done? That we have then an actual date we could tie to it. Well, I hope you notice the chronological distance between something like the 15th or 13th century BC and 622. So a long period and a long distance. And so really in our Theology Bit series, we're jumping forward, but it's helpful to do because it's helping us see what's a theology of retelling. What are they doing differently here than was before? Because as they retell a story, they are expecting it not to be wildly different. And this wasn't just any story. This was a formative story for who they were as a people of Israel. To retell it, you're pretty much stuck with a lot of the things that they really held to be true. Well, but they're going to contemporize it in very interesting ways. So first of all, if the focus that we have today for our Theology Bits is on Sinai, or Horeb, or the Ten Commandments, then, as you would imagine, the actual commandments themselves are very similar to the commandments that you had in Exodus. There's a few minor differences in wording and so on, but for the most part, they're quite similar. And for the details on that, you can look at our previous continuity and change in the Old Testament video on Sinai. But what's different is not the content of the Ten Commandments themselves, but the consequences of following them or not following them. And here, Deuteronomy is very different. It really emphasizes blessings and curses. Meaning, if you follow these commandments, you'll receive blessings. If you do not, you'll receive curses. Now, blessings and curses is in fact something that we have met before, especially in the book of Genesis, with related to Abraham. But it has not something that really came up in Exodus all that much. We're going to see why in a few different reasons. Remember that in the book of Exodus, the goal of Sinai was because they saw themselves as a society. How do you live together as a community? And how are these things going to do that? And remember, we talked about the big inclusion and revolution in thinking is including ethics in worship. How you live together as a society matters for worship. Well, Deuteronomy simply expects that is the case. It doesn't defend or argue for that position one way or the other because it's busy doing something else. And it's talking instead about, well, what happens when you follow these things? What happens when you do not follow these things? Well, there's going to be a very different focus. We start seeing not just how do you live in a society, but interest in justice in a particularly different way. For example, how do you treat the alien? How do you treat the widow? The orphan? And related to the alien, specifically, how do you deal with neighbors who are not Israelites? Other people. And they will talk about it in language of justice, using discourses about love in ways that will sound very contemporary to many people's ears, but not something that was especially in the book of Exodus, because there's a new focus. How do you relate to other people, to the neighbors, to the aliens? And in fact, these blessings and curses turn out to have to deal practically with the land. When they're blessed, they gain the land. When they're cursed, they lose the land. And to whom do they lose it? Well, once again, to the neighbors. From whom do they gain it? Once again, their neighbors. There's a lot about justice, and justice not just for Israel, but for others as well. And so we have a very different focus. It becomes kind of an international focus. We do have Torah, just as we had Torah in Exodus, but now it's how does Torah help us define ourselves vis-a-vis other nations or other Gentiles? That is, what makes us different? We are, as we talked about last time, the people of God. We're a society of God, but we're also a nation of God. And how does that relate to what came before? Well, it is going to structure that through conversations related to worship, but just like the societal structure of Exodus, it includes a lot of different things, but there's one big difference. The sacrifice made to God are going to be in one location and only one location. And this was very rare in the ancient world, that there would be one temple and only one temple. Before that, there's one tabernacle, kind of a traveling temple. And that there would not be multiple ones. Well, this is an interest in Deuteronomy. And why that interest? Well, of course, eventually, remember where they found this? In the temple, about the book of the law, King Josiah. That is, if everything's centralized in one location, which also, by the way, happens to be the nation's capital, then how do we hold together who we are in the face of the nations around us. And what's more, the blessings and curses that come forward are once about how are we held together as the people of God. So it's less about the expansiveness of worship of God. That's what Exodus emphasized, and more about how is it that we can prosper as a people of God. And or if we're not prospering, why not? What has happened? This theology is going to set up what we call the Deuteronomistic history, which then looks through the story of it when they're entering into their land to their being forcibly removed from it in 586 BC, after Deuteronomy is written, and with a Deuteronomistic editor who's going to look at this and ask this fundamental question: why are we prospering or not? Why did this all happen? And so this is another approach that looks at religion very differently, using the very story that they all held dear, but interpreting it in new ways. This has been Theology Bits. I'm Pastor Ben.